When my dad was in his 90s, I said one time, "Dad, I'm glad you lived to be as old as you have." And he said, "Well, I am too. What's your reason?" I said, "Well, I've got a couple of complaints about the way you raised me." He said, "Well, let's hear them. Whatever else you might say about my dad and my relationship, we were pretty straightforward with each other." And I said, "Well, growing up, you were such a perfectionist and so impatient." He said, "Well, your sister has said the same thing, but it's just not true. I just want things done right, and I want them done now." Yeah, right. I wasn't being entirely facetious, because I can remember as a boy when I would take a hammer to try to help Dad with a project. Dad was a carpenter by trade and a teacher by profession. He taught woodworking. And I would take the hammer and start to nail a nail, and instead of telling me how the best way to hold the hammer and to do the job, he would just simply take the tool himself and finish it because he knew I couldn't do it right. And I really did blame him a long time for my not having an interest in carpentry. The truth is that if I had been half the man then that I thought I was, I could have learned a lot more from my dad, because he had a lot to teach. I ran across a story some time back that Annie Dillard tells in her book, The Writing Life. She and her husband at the time, were spending their summers at a remote island out in the middle of the Haro Strait. That's a body of water that separates Canada from the state of Washington. And it's an island that has no electricity, and at that time had no telephone service. This was before cell phones. So the people who live there live a pretty isolated life, and most of them by choice. She had made friends with Paul Glenn, an artist who lives there year-round. One summer when they were there, and the next summer when they got there, she dropped by for a visit. Paul invited her in and poured coffee for them, and they sat down at the table, and she said, "Paul, how's your work going?" And he said, "You didn't know Farrar Burns. He died, about 20 years ago, I guess. Farrar and his wife built that house that's up there on Fishery Point, north of the island." He said, "Farrar was standing out on his beach one day looking out into the strait, and he saw a log come floating down the current, and he said to himself, 'That looks like yellow cedar. That's pretty good lumber. I think I'll go out and check on him.' So he launched his skiff, rowed out, caught up with the log. Sure enough, it was an 8-foot log of yellow cedar, pretty valuable timber. Had a big iron staple stuck in one end of it, so he tied onto it with a 20-foot length of rope that he had in his skiff and started bringing it back ashore to salvage it. Well, the tide was going out and caught him, and he kept rowing trying to get to the shore, but the tide kept taking him south. He was trying to go north to the end of the island. Tide was taking him south. He kept rowing, but making no headway. He rowed like that for the rest of the afternoon and into the night. Sunset about 9 o'clock. He kept on rowing. All the time he was losing ground. Moon came out about 3 hours later, and he realized by that time that he had gone all the way past the island. But he kept at it. And way after a while, the tide reversed. Now Farrar kept rowing, but this time he was rowing with the current, and it was taking him back, brought him all the way back up the island, and finally back up to the fishery point. His wife was staying out on the beach looking for him. She'd been worried about him all night. And he brought the log in, and she helped him, and they rolled it up above the waterline. And Paul, the artist, said, I saw him the next day and asked him how he was doing. And Farrar said, well, got a bit of a backache. He said, I didn't see his hands. Then he stopped, paused, looked out the window and smiled. Annie Dillard started to get up and take her coffee cup over to wash it. And Paul motioned for her to sit down. He said, so that's how it's going. She said, what? She had almost forgotten the question that she had asked, and she was sure by now that Paul himself had forgotten it. But he said, you asked me how my work is going. That's how it's going. I'm out in the middle of the current now, waiting for the tide to change so I could then to bring me in. But I just keep at it. I thought about that story, and I could see my dad without any problems in that skiff. I could see him rowing against the tide, staying with it, and bringing it in. And I can imagine him saying when somebody asks, how you doing? Well, I've got a bit of a backache. Because in my early days, I remembered him for his impatience and for his perfectionist. But as I remembered him as I get older, I remember him for his perseverance. I don't know of a job that he ever undertook, that he didn't finish. And I know there must have been times when he felt like the tide was going against him. Now, I don't know what you're up to. I don't know where you are or what you're doing, and I don't even know who you are, of course. But if you're engaged in something that's important to you, and if by chance you feel like you're out in the middle of the channel, waiting for the current to change and bring you in, I hope it does. And I hope this story helps.